Sophie Hardy and the Battle of the Myriad by M.R. Dale, narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 15, The Myriad. The four girls stopped a few paces into Meliora. The gaping holes their mouths were making hadn't closed, and the look of admiration and amazement that they all carried showed no sign of subsiding. Sophie did a full 360 turn and noticed that the group were now well and truly in and amongst the world of the mythicals. Kingsley continued to walk slightly faster than the others towards the skyscraper or city biome. Sophie was still struggling with the right word. He was now about 20 paces in front of the girls, and Sophie managed to focus her attention on him and what he was doing. She spied 3 creatures walking towards him, and she activated her zoom function to see who it was that Kingsley was about to interact with. All around them, the other mythicals had stopped their rushing around and were staring at them. It was like an enormous city had just paused to witness something wondrous, but the girls hadn't noticed this, as their gaze was still taken by the 3 creatures heading towards Kingsley. He had indicated for the girls to stop by raising his hand, but the 4 of them had been so enthralled that he had to physically stop, turn around, and tell them to cease walking. He didn't mind this, of course, as the looks on the girls' faces were worth it. Kingsley made his way forwards again, away from the group. From the distance they now were at, Sophie found the easiest creature to recognise was unquestionably Typhon, the winged giant. She had read once that he was seen to be so tall that his head brushed the stars. Now she could see that that had been a bit of an exaggeration, because while he was twice the size of a normal man, had the wings and tail of a dragon, he was never going to have such a problem. As she zoomed in further, Sophie noticed his fingertips which, according to myth, could grow dragons' heads themselves and then also breathe out fire. On top of his head were 2 enormous horns, and the nearer he got, the more intimidating and monstrous. Sophie hated herself for thinking that word. Sophie found him. The next one of the trio that Sophie could see was what appeared to be a normal-looking man. He had mostly jet-black hair with flashes of silver in, and wore an extremely smart grey suit with a black tie. The stubble on his face reflected the colour of his hair, and, as Sophie studied him further, she noticed how unbelievably hairy his hands were. Immediately, Sophie's gut reaction was that he was a werewolf, and therefore a creature more associated with the underworld than with other mythicals. Finally, the figure in the centre had Sophie most intrigued, a lady with a human upper half and a snake's lower half. She slithered along the ground as a snake would, but once you got to her torso, her body began to rise off the ground and stood up like a human would. Sophie at first thought it was Medusa, or a different one of the Gorgons, but then quickly identified Echidna, the goddess of all monsters, or the mother of monsters, depending on which story you believed, and, if mythology was accurate, the wife of the great and enormous Typhon. Sophie again immediately regretted thinking of her with those titles, which included the word monster, but that was what Sophie knew her as nasty as it now sounded. This made sense as to why she was in the middle. She was the most important, the leader of this extraordinary world, and here was Sophie, hopefully, about to meet her. Now that she had identified everyone and everything that she could have done in that relatively short time frame, Sophie felt ready to interact with something, and so started to wish that Kingsley would hurry up and bring the conversation over to them. Quicker than she thought would happen, Kingsley concluded his brief chat with the 3, turned, and was walking the 3 chiefs of the tribe over to the girls. Clara and Yasmin quickly cottoned on to what was happening, having still been aghast at where they were, and stood almost to attention like soldiers. Lizzie, meanwhile, continued to look around at everything. The sheer enormity of Typhon, glower of the yet unnamed werewolf man, and radiance of Echidna struck Sophie as they arrived to greet them. Although she was being faced with what she had always been taught were either monsters or something simply so horrifying that they were never to be spoken about, Sophie felt almost completely relaxed and safe. She could sense that no harm was going to come to her, and she finally let go of Clara's hand. The girls remained in their line, standing with remarkably straight backs and looks of disbelief on their faces. Even Lizzie was now looking at the creatures in front of her, but she clearly couldn't sense what Sophie could, and shuffled her feet slightly. Kingsley opened the dialogue. Sophie, Clara, Yasmin and Lizzie, this is Typhon, Lichen and Echidna. The girls didn't know what to say, So they did a sort of bow, curtsy, handshake type motion that brought a smile to Echidna. The two males, however, remained completely stern-faced. Echidna, Typhon and Lichen, this is Sophie, Clara, Yasmin and Lizzie, Kingsley concluded. Lichen the werewolf nodded in greet. Typhon knelt in front of the girls, but Echidna didn't move. It was almost as if she was waiting for Kingsley to say something else. Eventually, sensing the awkwardness in the air and spotting that every other creature in the area had stopped to see exactly what was going on, Sophie took it upon herself to step forward and went to shake Echidna by the hand. Saying nothing, Echidna just looked with her piercing yellow reptilian eyes at the hand that Sophie was offering, apparently unsure what it was she was supposed to be doing with it. Suddenly, Sophie felt remarkably insecure about whether she had done the right thing. Lichen turned his head towards them and growled through human wolf teeth. Had Sophie not realised he were a werewolf, she would have thought him quite mad. Sophie did, though, feel the warm air leave his mouth and could sense his eyes burning a hole in the side of her head. Feeling a rush of nerves pulsating through her, Sophie withdrew her hand and stepped back. She hoped she hadn't caused any offence. I'm sorry, she mumbled. Echidna put her gaze back onto Sophie's eyes and kept her face straight, which Sophie was finding frustratingly difficult to read. Sophie swallowed and could feel the anxieties of her three friends behind her. Sorry for what? Typhon asked, in an enormous booming voice that Sophie could have sworn made the windows in the skyscraper behind them shake. Lizzie squirmed at the sound, but recovered quite quickly. If I have caused offence, Sophie answered. Echidna smiled again, like she had done earlier. Typhon stood up to his full height and smiled, but broader than Echidna. Lichen, meanwhile, just shook his head. You have nothing to apologise for, Sophie. Ignore my husband. He is a tease, Echidna replied, smiling at Typhon, who gave her a smile back. Thank you, Your Majesty, came a voice from Sophie's left. Yasmin was down on one knee and was bowing. The other three looked at her to see exactly what and why she was doing what she was. There was a deathly silence before Yasmin looked up and realised that she looked foolish. Clara couldn't help but laugh at the silliness of what Yasmin both looked like and at what she was doing. Get up, Sophie told her through gritted teeth. Yasmin said no more and stood up. Echidna stepped forward and offered out a hand to Sophie, as Sophie had done earlier. Welcome, members of Scope. Kingsley has told us a lot about you and that we can trust you, Echidna said, thus bringing an end to the awkwardness that had been lingering. Thank you, Sophie replied. Typhon finished shaking his head and spoke once more with his incredibly booming voice. What is it you want? He asked in a tone that at first seemed was nowhere near as friendly as Echidna's, but Sophie put that down to the nature of the creature that he was. Sophie stumbled over an answer at first, but then decided on one that wouldn't show any potential threat that might be coming from King, and summed up why an 11-year-old human might have a reason to come here. We just want to learn and understand. Around her, Clara and Yasmin nodded as they could see that Sophie's answer was extremely clever. On top of that, Echidna seemed to nod in understanding, which told Sophie that her answer had been a good one. Walk with us, Echidna instructed them. At that, the four girls, three creatures, and Kingsley began to walk towards the huge skyscraper. I not only believe you, but I and the rest of the Myriad are grateful to you, Echidna began. Grateful? Why? Sophie asked, not seeing at all why this mythical, who she had never met, should be even the slightest bit grateful to her. You released thousands of our kind from that man-made prison, and because of you, they have found their families and friends here in Meliora. Without you, they would still be locked up there. They all owe you a huge debt, Echidna answered, and Sophie suddenly understood. As they walked through an enormous grass circle, which acted as the focal point to the whole place towards the skyscraper area, Sophie again counted her blessings that she could be living this. Once again, she was doing something that she had only ever dreamt of before. A few weeks ago, she was a regular 10-year-old at school, worried about leaving primary school and longing for technology that she couldn't have. But just look at me now, she thought to herself. It would be my honour to show you around the place we have been forced to call home for the last 10 years, Echidna said, and the group of 8 arrived at the most enormous wooden door to a building Sophie had ever clapped eyes on. She assumed it needed to be that large to allow creatures such as Typhon in and out. Echidna pressed a very futuristic button on the front, and it slowly opened with a loud creak. Sophie couldn't work out if the building was old or new. It was most unusual. Please, follow me, Echidna said, beckoning the group inside. Sophie didn't need to think twice about it. and stepped straight in with her friends close behind. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by M.R. Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, then be sure to check out our website, www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.